So Hutch and Kulinski of Secular Talk had a debate recently after they went a little bit back and forth on social media, I believe, and on YouTube. Just like they did the like kind of react to react kind of back and forth a little bit on this. Hutch was willing to debate him on whether or not the Harris campaign should be accepting in Republicans like Liz Cheney and championing them around, saying, hey, look at Liz Cheney, a Republican who's endorsing me, Harris, a Democrat. Look how reasonable I am. I'm a moderate. I can appeal to moderates. Please vote for me. I'm Harris. Big tent. Trump is crazy. And I think the purpose of it isn't necessarily, and this is my perspective before we get into this, I don't think the purpose of it is Liz Cheney's star power. Liz Cheney, the only thing you really know about Liz Cheney is that she's the daughter of Dick Cheney. And then maybe you'll apply some of the same things you applied to Dick to Liz. She used to be the third most powerful Republican in the House, but not many people necessarily remember that. They remember Dick Cheney, and they know that she's a Republican, and she knows that the Dick Cheney daughter. These are the two things they know. And for me, it's not about her star power. I think it's much more about the fact that she is a known Republican. When you hear her, you know she's a Republican, and you're showing that the Harris campaign is Big Tent. If there's room for her, then there might be room for you. If Liz Cheney thinks that Harris is a better option than Trump, then maybe the signal isn't even that Harris is great, it's that Trump's so bad that he's driving away the always declared Republicans. And so I think when you're dealing with such a tight margin, and there were so many Nikki Haley voters who broke with the Trump campaign in the primary, 20% to 30% who were still voting against Trump for Haley after he dropped out.
I wasn't sold on who to support in the Ukraine war until I learned they like chimkin nuggies. Slava Ukraini.
Amen. They sure do like their chicken nuggies. So I think that there could be some appeal to it. Look, I don't think that Liz Cheney should be the person that they're like front and center of the campaign. But when you're trying to appeal to Republicans, having Republicans like Liz Cheney, even if it's just a quick name you could throw out there, is useful. Just like broad scale, like just putting your hand towards the idea of bipartisanship or towards the idea of a big tent, while not presenting the people that would let those at home know it's a big tent. I think it's showing is better than telling. And by showing Liz Cheney, you are helping to show people that it is a big tent. And while it might not be helpful in putting forward a better policy platform, Harris just endorsed the decriminalization of marijuana on the federal level, and Liz Cheney's still on the platform. So as long as she can push forward progressive policies and still get these people's endorsements because of their dislike of Donald Trump, because of his anti-constitutional behavior, his anti-democratic behavior, then I say the more the merrier. As long as they're not dragging down the campaign and you're making commitments like, I won't support a public option or I won't support X, Y, and Z policy because of Cheney. Anyway, that's my position. Let's listen to these two go at it.
Let me just say, so I would say I disagree both on the strategy of touting the Cheney's endorsement and the substance of touting the Cheney's endorsement. I can come back to that in a little bit, but first, let me ask.
By the way, the substance of it, of the idea of, oh, is Liz Cheney great? Is Dick Cheney great? I don't really know how much I care about that. You know, this is an election. It's about convincing voters. And if you're not going to be, by championing them, championing their values, by saying, oh, you know, we're going to do the things that they're going to do, then I don't really see the problem. I mean, you maybe if you wanted, we could pick a more popular Republican who's not a Cheney, but you can't pick your allies necessarily all the time. If we could pick and choose who is endorsing Harris, I'd probably pick some people not named Cheney that are Republicans to give her a better Big Ten appeal. But those are not always the people that come over. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger might be somebody you could throw out there as, you know, a former Republican governor that also has star power that could do something like this similarly. But also, that's just one Republican. You need more than one Republican.
Ask you, and answers from both of you would be good. We can start with Hutch, but what would you say so far in the campaign that Kamala has done which is right, and what has she done that's wrong?
For me, the selection of Tim Walz, I was just going to say, for me, the selection of Tim Walz is huge because I've also been a big fan of Governor Walz long before the campaign. When he was like occasionally going out, he's not a high-profile Democratic governor, at least prior to this, the way that Gavin Newsom is, the way that Gretchen Whitmer is. But he would occasionally go on MSNBC and do the stump and make speeches. And when I look deeper into his record and what he was able to do with a single vote in the upper chamber of the Minnesota legislature, it's remarkable. This is a man who understands how to leverage power. And so for me, that is by far the most important thing that she's done. The fact that she went with somebody who doesn't have the name recognition or the profile and isn't the governor of a swing state as crucial as Pennsylvania, the way Governor Shapiro is, but somebody who's like, hey, listen, when I have majorities, I wield those majorities. I will push through my agenda. If Republicans want to get on board, that's great, but I will not let them cock block me. I love that, and that just got my heart a little pitter-pattering. So I think that is by far the best thing that she has done. In terms of what she has done wrong, I don't know. I feel like, even the things that she's done wrong, like her reluctance to distance herself from President Biden, I understand some of the hesitation they're giving that he is the sitting president.
And also the one who kind of like picked her and skipped the idea of a convention choosing the next nominee and some kind of free-for-all where Gavin Newsom could be the one ended up picked for the next nomination, even though he never won on any ticket, any vote from any voter. Harris could at least say that she was on the ticket. And when voters picked Biden, they picked Biden with the knowledge that she was a heartbeat away. Whereas Gavin Newsom, I mean, he's completely untested.
I would probably say, I don't know. I would probably maybe the quote unquote embrace of Dick Cheney, or perhaps not having a pro-Palestinian speaker at the DNC. But I think these things, in the grand scheme of things, are relatively minor errors of the Harris campaign, and they certainly pale in comparison to what she's done right, in my opinion.
Hutch, what would you say she's done right and wrong?
I totally agree with Josiah about picking Tim Walz. I think I would have been fine if she picked Shapiro. There were some tactical reasons for why that would have been a sound decision, but Walz, I think, added something to her campaign that she really needed, this sort of like relatability. And in my opinion, he's been pretty fantastic. I actually think that her catering her message to the center is really smart in this climate right now. So I would praise her for that, for using rhetoric that might appeal to Nikki Haley primary voters, centrist, moderate Republicans, old school Republicans in states like Arizona, which may prove to be a crucial state. On the bad side, I guess the biggest criticism that I would have for her is that I think she probably should have had a more aggressive media schedule earlier on, though I do understand that she had very little time to cobble a campaign together. And so there's just...
that would be a critique about, for example, the announcement of the decriminalization policy federally on marijuana. That's something that the majority of Americans support. And we're at a point where, once it's being legalized in the majority of states, now we're talking about, okay, now it's time to take federal action. Once you've gotten majority of states, majority of the public support, if we announced that like a few more weeks prior, another month prior, we had more time to roll that out, send out campaign materials to a lot more people about it, I think it could have had a better impact. Also, I don't know if we should have started immediately with the racialized angle. I think first pitching it to the general public and then branching out to talking about its specific impact on the Black community might have been smarter. I don't know if it had the desired impact, but I'm not an expert in that, so what would I know? I'm just a peasant.
There's going to be a lot of like logistical things that you work out in the beginning, like who do you staff your campaign with, and sort of ironing out what your platform's going to be, what your messaging is going to be. I'm happy to see that she's going on a lot of alternative media podcasts right now. I think that was really smart that she went on Fox News. I think the idea of her going on Rogan is a little bit scary, but honestly, to me, she proved that she can, last night with her interview with Brett Baer, that she can handle those kinds of tough questions. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I wish she would have started doing that like 3 weeks ago. Yeah.
Krystal, what do you think? What do you think she's done right and wrong? I'm curious your answer as well.
First of all, something that you all will find enjoyable. I just saw this headline from right-wing media outlet PJ Media. Did Kamala's Fox News meltdown just end her campaign?
They wish, man. They wish that was the case.
She did. I think she did a great job on that. But go ahead, Krystal.
Yeah. So my issue. Listen, I understand, and I'm open to the strategy of
I think she did okay. I mean, I thought it was leaned more towards a wash and like a domination. I think she got some clips out of it, and she showed that she could put herself in an adversarial environment, which was a big critique of her up to this point. So that was an achievement of it itself. And she got like 7.1 million viewers compared to the like 3 or something million that Trump got at his like town hall at the same day. So, that was a win too, I suppose. But I mean, I don't think she particularly dominated the 30-minute conversation.
Embracing Republicans, having them on the DNC stage.
She looked stiff though. She looked strong. I mean, like strong as in she was resilient in the interview, and she like, wait a second, that's not the correct clip. Which she was right, it wasn't. When they were talking about, fighting the enemy within, which Trump just keeps saying again and again and again, and she quotes it, and it's like, oh, we got a quote of it. Then it's just not a quote of it. And Brett Baer even later, like the day after on Fox, said, yeah, well, we did actually bring up the wrong clip. How many people are going to see him clarifying that versus the 7.1 million that watched the interview? Probably a lot less, but,
Age, basically, leaning into this idea of we have a broad anti-Trump coalition, and look at even these reasonable Republicans who served with Trump, who previously supported him, like they're in our camp now. But I don't think you can do that alone. And I also think they've leaned too hard into that strategy. Embracing Dick Cheney and thanking him for his service would be a perfect example of leaning too hard in that direction, both from a moral standpoint, because Dick Cheney is, I think, one of the most evil and nefarious wrongdoers in American politics, certainly in modern history, but also from a tactical perspective. Like, Dick Cheney left office with a 13% approval rating. Liz Cheney is similarly not particularly popular. So I'm not sure that they are getting as much out of it tactically as they think they are. But my bigger beef is the fact.
Can I say about like Donald Trump, when he left office, he had like a 32 or 33% approval rating post J6. Now, when people look back at the Trump presidency, they rate it like 48% favorability. People could say like, oh, well, after they looked at the facts. I think a lot of this is just like problems with memory. George Bush's approval rating. Go look at that. Go look at that post facto, how people view George Bush's presidency looking back now. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. And I'm not saying that all the people love Dick Cheney now, but I am saying that I think assuming that it's back down at its lowest point right now, I don't know about that. What I will say about Dick Cheney, not particularly popular guy, but you don't need him to be a particularly popular guy. If we're waving around his endorsement outside of areas where he specifically, like, we know historically he might have had some areas of support for the idea of him specifically, his name and the love for him bringing votes, yeah, that'd be silly. But if you're showing him as an example of a broad strokes coalition of people of different backgrounds that are not left-leaning, that are not center-left, that would traditionally not support Democrats, to show a break, to show that this is a big tent, this is not a normal election, and people who would regularly not vote for Harris due to her economic philosophy, due to her social philosophy, due to the fact that she's a Democrat, are voting for her because of her opponent. Because of what her opponent has said about the Constitution, because of what their opponent did on January 6th, because of what their opponent tried to do when it came to taking the results of the election and throwing them out, or any other number of actions. I think that message is useful. I think that's useful, and therefore taking a Dick Cheney endorsement for that purpose, I'm not against it, especially in a very close election. Look, if we were 10 points up, then I wouldn't care. Then throw Dick Cheney, throw Liz Cheney, throw them all to the roadside. We don't have to care. We got a blue wave coming in all intents and purposes. We got the Senate, we got the House, we got the presidency. Let's go. That's not the situation we're in. Now, it's one thing to say that maybe instead of putting Liz Cheney in front of the camera in this moment, it might have been more cost effective to campaign on this issue. But having that tool in your tool belt to be able to throw that out there, that you've got Republican endorsements, that you can be bipartisan, especially since a lot of Americans know that it's going to be likely a divided House or a very small majority, which is a good reason why I think Tim Walz was a good pick for VP. Small majority. He's somebody who governed his state with a small majority. I think it can be useful.
That they haven't paired that with leaning into a consistent messaging on bread and butter issues. I was also extremely excited when she picked Tim Walz, because I thought here's a guy that's got like a ready-made agenda that he actually passed in the state of Minnesota, and she can just rip that off. Like, just, I'm going to do what Tim did there. We're going to pass paid family leave. We're going to make sure people can, you know, go to free public college. We're going to do tax breaks for the working class. Like, it was all free school lunch, free school breakfast. It was all sort of there for. And I'm not saying that she hasn't had policy plans and that they don't talk about it, but there isn't this consistent, overwhelming, you know, these are the three things she's going to say every time she opens her mouth. And those are things that are, yes, I think they're progressive.
I don't know. I hear it's, you know, $25,000 for first time home buyers, build 3 million homes. And, I mean, I don't know what, I mean, I'm thinking of other policies she's thrown out there, but, you know, child tax credit, bringing back the child tax credit. Those are like the three big ones I usually hear, which, I mean, those are like policies that are not hated, you know, but it would be good to have more diversity when she's throwing those things out there. I think the free school lunches thing is a winner.
But they're also centrist in that they are the center of American economic opinion. So to me, the problem isn't that she has this, like, let me brag about the Republicans that support me strategy. It's leaning too heavily on that. The endorsement from Dick Cheney is just unacceptable in general, but leaning too heavily into that without also countering it with, you know, things that would get young people, working class people more excited about her campaign. And then obviously, to me, the biggest just outrageous moral failure is continuing to back a genocidal policy in Gaza and not even really giving any sense that there's any distance whatsoever between herself and Joe Biden, which, you know, I believe that they think is a smart tactical decision. I think it's a disastrous tactical decision, but the more important thing is it's utterly, you know, disgusting morally.
So,
okay, so morally, you can have that own argument. Tactically, I mean, I just don't, what would she say, or what would you ask of her to make it so that she could keep her lead with Jews in Pennsylvania, which is a Democratic constituency that generally votes with Democrats pretty consistently and is a very large constituency, about like 440,000 people in a state in Pennsylvania where 20 to 30,000 votes could be the difference.
Immoral, morally corrupt.
I don't think the logic isn't completely there that she needs to show some support for Israel in order to keep that voting bloc consistent with Democrat votes, or keeping them voting with Democrats. I can see the strategic logic to it. As for the idea that, like, what policy reversal, because it'd be one thing if you're like, she needs to show more strength when standing up to Netanyahu, and more strength when it comes to, if you don't do this one thing, then maybe we'll stop weapon shipments here, here, and here. But the idea that she needs to, like, turn around and say there's a genocide in Gaza, Israel is, you know, perpetuating this war needlessly, they need to end it, if she just goes out and goes hard, that's gonna, like, get her up in the polls. No, I don't think that's the case. Majority of Americans, when they poll and you just ask them, are they more sympathetic with Israel or Palestine, they pick Israel. A lot of people will say both, but they pick Israel if you only give them a choice of one or the other. And Jewish people tend to vote. And Pennsylvania is a state the Harris team views as needs to win. So is Michigan, but they need to win Pennsylvania. So it's not that I completely discount the idea that the rhetoric could change and she could say, like, I want to approach this maybe from a different view, or, you know, this is an opportunity to turn a page and show a new perspective on how to deal with the region, where Trump heightened the region's tensions with the recognition of Jerusalem. We were unable to find a solution during this first term, but during my term, we can turn the page. Like, I'm sure there could be some way to pitch it, but I don't think just like turning to, this is a genocide, I'm going to end all shipments tomorrow, I don't think this is going to have any effect on the polls. In fact, I think the flip-floppy nature of how that would look could, in fact, actually make it look worse in the polls. I really don't know, but I don't know. I just haven't been convinced of this.
Let me give my answer, then we'll get your guys' reaction, because I thought a lot about this. What has she done that's good? What has she done that's bad? Let me start with the good. First, let me sign off on everything you guys said about
Muslim voters in Michigan don't matter, apparently. I don't know who you're talking to. Of course those voters matter. But, okay, one second. Let's talk about how many people live in Dearborn, Michigan. About 100,000 people live in Dearborn, Michigan. So this is the place where we talk about this the most, or where this is having the most impact. Of that percentage, a decent part of it, I don't know how much, live in Dearborn, Michigan. If it's 50% Muslim, it's 40% Muslim. But we're talking about tens of thousands of people that could potentially be turned off of voting for Harris because she did not take a stronger stance for Palestine. The argument that needs to be made is that the votes that she gets for turning around her position and marching in the other direction from those people, assuming that all the voting deadlines, that they could get these votes in time, or get these people that they would want to motivate to go vote and get enough energy behind them to get them off their ass to go vote, that they could do that in this time period, that they would energize them enough and get them up to the voting booths enough to make up for any potential votes that they would lose. And the constituency that they know has a solid history of voting for Democrats. For them, they could see it as a gamble. Roll the dice on taking a position that would be more conciliatory towards the pro-Palestine crowd, which many would probably still see as not enough. Because, I mean, if she says that Israel's committing genocide and X, Y, and Z, and she goes like full balls to the wall, she starts marching with like the college protesters, I don't think that has electorally beneficial outcomes for her. I don't. I do not. But if she takes some position that's somewhat conciliatory, you try to take the more moderate approach here, even then you need to do the calculation of how many votes is she picking up for losing. And I just don't see the math there. I don't see the math. And you're doing it for a constituency that, are we sure, would have otherwise voted with the same enthusiasm or at the same percentages or have the same turnout? I don't know that. So I'm not saying I'm unconvincible. I'm saying I'm just unconvinced of the immediate strategic necessity of shifting tone towards Krystal's tone, if that's what she's asking for. If she's saying she needs to shift slightly in this direction and try to shave some votes, but being careful to try to keep the votes she needs in Pennsylvania, that's one thing. But I didn't hear that nuance.
Tim Walz, totally agree with that. That got me genuinely excited.
And I'm not even talking about morals here. She just said strategically. And so I'm just addressing the fact of the matter that this is a consistent Democrat voting bloc. They're still polling that they're going to vote Democrat this election. Do you want to roll the dice on that for a voting bloc that it might still not be enough for, and that polling-wise right now, there's just not that enthusiasm for the Harris campaign?
About Kamala. Like, I was genuinely like giddy the day that she picked Tim Walz. Yeah, because I know his record is phenomenal. So I love that. I loved when they came out of the gate with the weird stuff. The weird stuff took off like wildfire, and it all stemmed from a shoot from the hip comment from Tim Walz in an interview, and it just took off like wildfire. It was great. I love the "we're not going back" stuff. People were chanting that at rallies endlessly. I love that they're embracing freedom, and they bring that up all the time. I love how they've basically stolen patriotism from the Republicans. I think that's great. Just recently, they both started using the F word about Donald Trump, fascist, and they cite General Mark Milley calling him that, and they say, look, the general said it. Well, what do you want me to say? It's true. He's saying it. I love that. I love the $6,000 child tax credit. I love the 3 million new homes. I love the policy where Medicare is going to cover home care. I think it's a crime that the media didn't talk about that more, and she's out there touting it, and good on her for doing that. I love that in this the Fox interview. I love that. I think she did a great job. She hit Trump on getting out of the Iran deal. I thought that was great. The bad stuff is as follows, in my opinion. There was reporting that the Biden team kind of talked her off of the weird framing and the "we're not going back" framing. They changed "we're not going back" to "turn the page" or something like that. It's just not popping as much as "we're not going back." So that's just a little messaging thing there.
I do think "we're not going back" does hit harder than "turn the page"
that I have issue with. I loved when she came out of the gates talking about the ban on price gouging, because it's great politics, because then you baited the Republicans into calling you a communist, and then they had to go out there and functionally they were defending price gouging. And there's like 39 states in the country that have bans on price gouging if there's like a natural disaster or something like that. She looked incredibly populist and incredibly anti-establishment, and Donald Trump and the Republicans were taking the mantle of, no, we're going to defend the establishment and we're going to defend Americans getting ripped off. So I love that, but she backed off of the ban on the price gouging thing after there was a lot of, noise around that. She didn't have the answer for the question. I believe you alluded to this, Josiah. She didn't have an answer for the question, how are you different than Joe Biden, the first 2 times she was asked that. I think that's bad.
It's bad, but I mean, I think it's explainable through, again, do you want to piss off the one person who just fingered you for the job when it could have been an open convention? Well, not an open convention in the idea the voters vote, but the idea that the convention floor would decide it. So, I mean, for her, it makes sense politically, But when it comes to electorally, yeah, she has to differentiate herself from the previous administration. People need to get to know her. People need to know why she's different than Joe.
I really, really dislike the saying that Iran is our biggest enemy. That just came out recently, and that is kind of the.
It's bizarre. I think it's a way to try to maybe shore up support on this on this perceived foreign policy weakness to counter the Republicans' attacks on the issue. Maybe. I think it's a very spur of the moment type of statement. I don't think after the election it's the type of thing she would say. I don't think that's what many geopolitical experts would say either, that it's our main threat. I mean, the main threats you would hear about would either be China or, and even though it's said a lot less, Russia. But Iran? Really? A regional threat? You could say that, obviously, from its funneling of weapons to the Houthis, funneling of weapons to Hezbollah, helping the Assad regime stay up by helping sending Hezbollah to go butcher the Syrian people, funneling weapons to Hamas. I mean, you could point at any of that, but the biggest threat to the United States, nah. I didn't feel. I said it at the time. It felt weird. I didn't believe it, and I still don't buy it.
The fear with like touting the Liz Cheney and the Dick Cheney stuff is like, well, how much of this do you, like some foreign policy stuff, do you kind of agree with them on? Because the Iran thing, I don't like at all. Not saying Trump's good on Iran. He's actually, I think, worse on Iran, but that's neither here nor there. And to Krystal's point, leaning too much into the Cheneys supporting her, I think it's strategically wrong, and I think it's morally wrong. I'm okay with her saying, like, Liz Cheney endorsed me. What I have a problem with is doing a big event where you, like, brag about it and saying the thing about thank you for your service to Dick Cheney. And as evidence of my theory, I would, and this, earlier in the week, I was very down on the campaign, and the reason was there was a new slate of polls that came out, and it looked like she dropped about 2 points, and this came right on the heels of all of, like, the Cheney stuff.
Cheney
I'm not saying it's exclusively the fault of the Cheney stuff, but I think it's just this broader trend that I was afraid of. Now, she has course corrected since then a little bit with this Fox News interview, which I think was great. But the point is, Liz Cheney, as you pointed out, 93% voting with Trump. Dick Cheney had a 13% approval rating, as you pointed out, lied us into the Iraq war, ordered illegal torture, ordered illegal spying, got rid of due process and habeas corpus, took $44 million from Halliburton and gave them no bid contracts afterwards, had Guantanamo Bay, expanded the doctrine of unitary executive theory, which is the thing that we all are like, no, Trump wants to expand unitary executive theory. Dick Cheney did that. So the problem is, and then I'll turn it over to you guys. I'm sorry, I know I've been going for a long time here.
No, go ahead.
So it's strategically bad, and I think it's substantively bad because Dick Cheney I view as Trump before Trump. And the larger issue is what I worry about Democrats, and this happened with Hillary in 2016, is you end up appealing to Republicans in the general election. Okay. But you over appeal to Republicans while Republicans appeal to their base. So I guess the point is, stop taking your base for granted like Hillary. I think they should care more about Arab Americans and Muslim Americans and Lebanese Americans, particularly in Michigan. This is a demographic that they should be winning by massive numbers, and care more about young voters and just give less attention to Dick Cheney. Finally, the thing I would do to check this box of try to get Republican votes, go to, like, how Trump made a big deal about saving the carrier factory, and then they ship the jobs overseas anyway. You go take some people from the carrier factory who lost their jobs and they're Republicans, and you do an event with them, and they say, hey, I voted for Donald Trump, but he stabbed us in the back and I lost my job. And 200,000 manufacturing jobs were outsourced under Trump. That's the way of, like, appealing to working class Republicans, as opposed to taking elitist war criminal Republicans who nobody likes and running around the country with them. I'm sorry for how long that was. Hutch, I'll let you respond first since you did.
For me, I agree that this is a good thing or a good idea to do, but when you hear Cheney, there's a lot of things associated with it. A lot of good, a lot of bad, but Republican is something that's associated with it. And the purpose of a big tent movement against somebody who is an institutional threat, which is one of the pitches of the campaign, is that if somebody's an institutional threat, then everybody, the big tent forms and it expands and you would see untraditional allies, right? So it's supposed to give the perspective of a broad strokes coalition that's open to everyone, right? And that's an advantage of, for example, the Hungarian opposition to Viktor Orban that's surging right now. One of the advantages is they have a broad strokes coalition that has conservatives and non-conservatives because they don't like the authoritarian tendencies of Viktor Orban all under one umbrella. One of the downsides is it's kind of hard to get a general ideological outline of what they actually believe because there's such a broad strokes coalition. Thankfully, it seems right now that Harris can endorse marijuana legalization and still get a Cheney endorsement. So I don't really know what policy she could throw out right now that's going to reverse courses with either Liz Cheney or a Mark Cuban or any of these people at this point, this close to the bell, especially since they've already thrown their cart with that horse. But I still don't see a necessary downside in taking this endorsement and just running with it as an example of a broad strokes coalition, not an example of what you should expect from the future of the Harris administration.
Did the video, and then Josiah will get your reaction.
Yeah.
Well, you brought up Liz Cheney's favorability ratings by the time she left office. The reason why her favorability ratings were so low is because she made the decision to essentially willingly sacrifice her political career to go after Trump.
I didn't bring that up. I brought up Dick Cheney's, not Liz. Liz, I didn't bring up her favorability. Yeah.
You know, I'm not sure how much I would push back against the Dick Cheney thing. I think Josiah and I both probably agree that maybe she used a little too soft language with that, like saying she was like thanking him for his service. I think is probably a little bit too far.
Too far on because you don't think it's tactically sound, or because you don't think it's morally sound, since you would accept Satan's endorsement if you thought it moved some votes.
Well, maybe both. Maybe I was being a bit hyperbolic when I said I would accept Satan's, but
I don't know if it's tactically sound. I think it's probably a wash.
Actually, worse than Satan. That's the point.
I don't think anybody's changing their vote dependent upon her like saying thank you for your service to Dick Cheney.
Sure. I mean, I don't know.
But I don't think it's really morally sound because I think he had shit service.
I feel like wasn't there a quote from who's the actor that played him in the movie? I think he said he took inspiration from Satan when he was trying to.
Oh.
Yeah, right. So yeah, but going back to what you were saying about like how she should be differing herself from Biden, there was a part in a video that you made recently where you said one of the ways that you would differ yourself from Biden would be that you would say that you would have gone about Build Back Better differently, and you would have forced Joe Manchin to just go along with this piece of legislation. This is one of the big sticking points that I have with probably both of you guys. What does that look like when you say you're going to force Joe Manchin to sign on to legislation? Because when I look at every single president is going to be constrained by the Congress that they have. Even LBJ and FDR, who had absurd majorities in comparison to what Biden was working with in 2021. He had a 50-50 Senate, and what do we have, like an 8-seat majority in the House? And so you basically need perfect unanimity in the party if you want to pass any part of your agenda. I look at his legislative track record, and I'm impressed. Like, to me, Joe Biden has been the most successful president legislatively in the modern era, and it's
I agree.
not even
domestically, I agree.
Particularly close. So yeah, I guess I would want to press you guys on, or press you, Kyle, specifically when you say you would force Joe Manchin to just sign on to Build Back Better. What does that actually look like in practice?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. That's a phenomenal question. So, it's basically the carrot and stick.
What I hear is threaten to open an investigation to his daughter. And when I hear that, all I'm thinking about is like immediately like just scandal. Democrat threatened to let Joe Manchin's daughter's crimes go away if he votes for his corrupt socialist legislation. I'm just immediately thinking about like once like if that gets out that he said I will investigate your daughter for crimes unless you vote this way. I mean, what is that not, number one, like some version of like quid pro quo and not an abuse of the justice system?
Approach. So you mentioned LBJ there, you mentioned FDR there. Yes, they had big...
I'm not saying that that's what Kyle Kulinski is going to propose, but that's like one of the options I heard, and I just never thought it was a realistic option.
Majorities, but they also knew how to play politics in a way that modern day Democrats in the neoliberal era, I don't think they play politics nearly as well. So, for example, Joe Manchin's daughter is a pharmaceutical criminal.
Oh, God. He really is right. If she's a pharmaceutical criminal, go after her no matter what. Just go after her.
Responsible for jacking up, what is it, the insulin prices colossally?
Don't remember.
I don't know if it was insulin or something else, but
I think it was insulin.
There was reporting on how his daughter is basically a pharma criminal. And for somebody like Joe Manchin or for somebody like Kirsten Sinema, basically if you're president, you use the bully pulpit a little bit, you call them into your office and you say, look, you're a Democrat, you could be a hero and they'll build statues to you, or you'll be my biggest enemy. And so you get to choose. If you don't vote with Build Back Better, then the Democratic Party is going to use all of our resources to fund a primary opponent against you to try to take you out. Or if you do the right thing, like I said, they'll build statues to you. So use...
Now, the primary opponent thing just will never work on Joe Manchin. It just will never work on Joe Manchin. Who is going to replace Joe Manchin in West Virginia? He's not going to be the senator from there anyway very shortly. He's going to be replaced. But who would have? Who? Richard Ojeda? Who is that woman that was talking about challenging him? What was her name? Can anybody remind me? Very progressive woman, Bernie Sanders squad, kind of. I believe she was one of the Justice Democrat candidates at the start. Man, somebody must remember. We're a chat full of a bunch of politics nerds. What was her name? Somebody must remember. I forget her name, but who would replace him? The fact that we had a Democratic senator from West Virginia in the first place was already like a bloody miracle. AOC, no, not AOC, from West Virginia. Christopher Wallace. Is AOC from West Virginia? Paula Jean Swearingen, that's who it was.
This is what politics always has been, right? There's a lot of ugly stuff that goes on behind closed doors, but if you're doing tactical stuff behind closed doors that ends up getting the American people colossal wins that they need, like Build Back Better, which I think was a phenomenal piece of legislation, I think that's how you do it. And I'm not saying it would have worked, because I don't know if it would have worked. But what I'm saying is it would have been the right path to at least get maybe more, as opposed to we got the Inflation Reduction Act, which was good, but it was what, maybe 20% of what was in the original Build Back Better. So I just don't see that Biden and modern day Democrats, Obama, Clinton, they don't have the same sort of commitment to social democracy as, say, FDR had. And so they don't want to play that dirty game of politics behind the scenes. Whereas when you look on the Republican side, I think Trump does use the bully.
LBJ did corrupt stuff all the time, but was able to get legislation passed because of it. I do not like the they go low, we go high stuff Democrats do. Look, if Republicans are like janking the system and doing it in a way so that you can only have any version of a fair fight by doing the same thing, okay, it is what it is. If it's within the bounds of the law, it's within the bounds of what is allowed within the system, it is what it is. But the purposeful weaponization of the Justice Department, I think, is bad. I think it's a bad idea to open that can of worms in the era of Donald Trump. Because if you can give anyone a reason to say, well, letting him get away with it is fine because X, Y, and Z happened before, I don't think that's smart. I don't think that's good. I don't think that's good to normalize. And so then, yeah, that concerns me. It's not that I'm like, I want to play patty cake with the Republicans. I'm happy with some hardball activities. I'm happy to, do what is within the bounds of what is allowed. But if the question is, are we going to weaponize the Justice Department and use it for politically partisan reasons to get legislation passed and allow financial criminals and pharmaceutical criminals get away with their crimes in order to get legislation passed, rewarding the rich and powerful, mind you, because if it was somebody else committing a crime and we found them and we knew of it, we would just go to prison. But is Joe Manchin's daughter? Oh, they don't get to stay away if Joe Manchin does this favor. I don't like it. Look, on an individual basis to get one piece of legislation through, I can understand how you can justify it for that immediate cost-benefit analysis, but long-term, institutionally, that type of corrosive effect could be pretty negative. So I'm thinking about it from an institutional angle, not from a party angle of getting one piece of legislation passed. And plus, you wouldn't just need Joe Manchin, you would have also need Kyrsten Sinema. So let's say that we got this on Joe Manchin, we even got him after weaponizing the Justice Department, we still needed to do that to Kyrsten Sinema. We don't got anything like that on Kyrsten Sinema. Maybe there's something else on Kyrsten Sinema, but I don't know about it.
Pulpit, he does use the carrot or the stick. He just uses it for really, really bad things, which we hate.
Can I just offer one other example
Sure.
that I think is a little more clear cut than, because you're right.
Here's an easier way, and somebody just described an example in chat. Hey, we would love for you to vote for this piece of legislation, and I was really considering, this infrastructure project, over here in this area of West Virginia. I was thinking if we were gonna, make a tunnel here in this mountain to connect this community to the state capitol, but, you know, I need to see that, you know, our priorities are accomplished so we can concentrate on these other local infrastructure priorities. You know, I know that's more of the carrot than it is the stick, but I mean, that's an example of something that would be within the bounds that has always been within the bounds, even if it isn't the utmost behavior of a fiscal conservative.
Build back, you know, he could have.
Even though the fiscal conservatives do the type of stuff all the time anyway.
Promised Joe Manchin, like, I'm going to pave West Virginia in gold and you're going to be a hero. And, you know, we're all, if you don't go with us, like, he could have used that approach. And there's no guarantees that it would have worked because of who Joe Manchin is and his, you know, political realities or whatever. There's no guarantees. But you also had a situation where they were trying to push through a $15 minimum wage increase. And they went to the parliamentarian and said, can we do this? And parliamentarian is not an elected official. There's nothing in the law that says you have to, you know, that the decisions of the parliamentarian, which are really just meant to be guidance, are binding.
So what they're talking about is that the Senate parliamentarian said that you couldn't, like, that you couldn't pass $15 minimum wage with budget reconciliation, that you would still need 60 votes. You couldn't just do it with 50 with a tie break. And what she's saying is that the VP, Harris, could have chosen to disregard that and do it anyway. That is true, but you would need the support of Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. And we're just talking about convincing Manchin. We still would have had to convince Kyrsten Sinema, and I don't think that was feasible. If somebody can give me an idea or two of how that could be accomplished otherwise, I'd like to hear it.
What's more, you can hire a new parliamentarian at any time.
That's what Bush did.
And instead they're just like, no, they said no, so I guess we can't do it.
I'd like to respond to this if I may, because
Yeah,
Hutch
go ahead.
actually
Sure,
changed
go
my
ahead.
mind on one of these things. So just again, full disclosure, I'm totally sympathetic. If you look at my Twitter feed or my YouTube videos, one of the things I advocate for is a more ruthless Democratic Party. It's one of the reasons why, again, I am so impressed by the selection of Governor Tim Walz, because again, this is a person who leverages power despite razor-thin majorities.
Correct,
If you have
yeah.
power and you're dealing with a minority opposition, you should do everything that is tactically feasible to push through your agenda. And I do think that Democrats sometimes struggle with that posture. You know, Attorney General Merrick Garland, to me, is a classic example of a guy who, you know, this was an appeal to bipartisanship. You know, he was a successful prosecutor back in the day. He was a centrist judge, President Obama's Supreme Court nominee. And I almost like as a mulligan or a consolation prize, like, hey, we couldn't make you a Supreme Court justice, we'll make you an attorney general. I think he's a very intelligent man. I think in many ways he's been a disastrous attorney general because he has been so lethargic. He's quick to prosecute and investigate Democrats. He drags his feet when it comes to Donald Trump. So this to me is just a great example. However, I do think that the realities of the 50-50 split Senate would make it extremely difficult and very dangerous for President Biden to have put the sort of pressure on Joe Manchin that you talk about. So Joe Manchin being a very conservative Democrat in a state.
Also, it's not even a completely unheard of in history in West Virginia. West Virginia used to be a blue state. Then times changed, it turned red, and now the West Virginia Democratic Party is a shell of its former self. This wouldn't be the first time that a Democrat that had been elected using Democrat funds, Democrat campaigners, had switched and flipped parties. Jim Justice, the current governor of West Virginia, was a Democrat and he flipped parties after running as a Democrat, using Democrat financing to do it. So if you tell Joe Manchin that you're going to go after his daughter with, you know, criminal liability, if he doesn't vote for your legislation, what stops him from flipping parties and then trying to rely on his local reputation in West Virginia? Then what? Then we've lost the Democrat vote, and you've made it look like that you've bullied him out of the party by threatening to go after his daughter.
That is effectively unwinnable for the Democrats. There's no way that a Democrat's going to win West Virginia outside of Joe Manchin. I think that had President Biden done what you suggested, Kyle, it would have been very easy for Joe Manchin to say, you know what, fuck you. I'm going to switch parties. I'm either going to become an independent who may caucus with the Republicans, or I may just go ahead and switch parties and become a Republican anyway. And he actually probably would have increased his likelihood of winning re-election should he, if he had chosen to run for a second term. Kirsten Sinema is more vulnerable, so I'm more sympathetic to the carrot and stick approach with her since Arizona is a purple state. But it's not just that there's a risk of it not working. There's a risk of it backfiring spectacularly. And the only other thing I'll just say real quick to Krystal's point about the parliamentarian is I agree. President Biden could have pressured Chuck Schumer to fire the parliamentarian. That could have been done. But this is where actually Hutch persuaded me. He changed my mind on this because he pointed out that, if I remember correctly, Sinema and Manchin both opposed the $15 bill or provision in the bill. So even if they'd gotten it included in the bill, that probably just would have killed the bill. So sorry for, that's my spiel.
Go ahead, Hutch.
People bring up.
Go ahead, Hutch.
People bring up the Right. People bring up the parliamentarian as though it's an example of fecklessness, and to me, it's just.
Somebody in chat just asked for like a war update. I'll do one quickly after this segment. Somebody said they hadn't heard a war update in a bit.
And as though it's an example of fecklessness, and to me, it's just an example of just pretty basic logic. Like it wouldn't have mattered if it fired the parliamentarian, because to Josiah's point, he's absolutely right. Both Sinema and Manchin, as far as I'm aware, were on the record against the $15 an hour minimum wage. And I have a sense that they probably wouldn't have been the only ones. Like, also, localized in West Virginia, it makes sense he was against $15 minimum wage because West Virginia has a much lower cost of living than the rest of the country. Wages over there are on average low. So it makes sense that they would want something that's more localized to, economic environments. So there's also like a real reason from his perspective for him to be against $15 minimum wage. Like, I just don't think it was going to be won by this gambit, man. There might have been 3 or 4 other Democratic senators who were not open about it, who might have voted against that $15 an hour minimum wage. When you talk about Joe Manchin's daughter in the bully pulpit, I don't really know what that means. It sounds like what you're saying is that Joe Biden should have
open a criminal investigation. Open a criminal investigation. If you don't vote for Build Back Better, we're going to open a criminal investigation because she objectively is a criminal, not because it's bullshit and she's not a criminal. I'm not saying do a fake investigation. I'm saying do a real investigation. Who is supposed to make that threat?
Who's supposed to make that threat?
Joe Biden, anybody in the administration, be very direct with them. Say, look, like I said, you'll be a hero or you'll be our biggest enemy. And it's not like the daughter isn't a criminal. I mean, I think she should be prosecuted anyway, but I'd be willing to not prosecute if Joe Manchin's vote comes on for either Build Back Better or at least a piece of legislation that is stronger than what the IRA ended up being.
Well, here's how I see that playing out. Joe Biden invites Joe Manchin into the Oval Office and says, listen, if you don't sign on to this Build Back Better as is, I'm going to sick Merrick Garland on your daughter. First of all, and if he actually relayed that plan to Merrick Garland, first of all, I think Merrick Garland would have resigned immediately and gone to the press and said, I cannot serve under a corrupt administration who would sick the DOJ on a political opponent to try to whip votes for a piece of legislation that I like. And I think to Josiah's
Merrick Garland would be one of the worst picks for a plot like this for an AG.
Point, Joe Manchin would have immediately switched to either independent or Republican, and then there goes your majority, and you don't get any legislation done whatsoever.
But I don't know why that's corrupt.
This idea, it's corrupt. We have longstanding.
It's a weaponization of the criminal justice system. That's what it is. If she's a criminal, she should be prosecuted whether or not her father is wealthy and powerful and can be influential in getting your political objectives achieved. I understand that's that's how dirty politics works. But, I mean, that could end up easily backfiring because it's dirty politics. Deal with a dirty bomb, it might go off.
Norms to keep the DOJ separate from politics. The president is never supposed to be able to just sick the DOJ on whoever they want. Donald Trump did it openly in the final month. I mean, he did it openly during his entire presidency, but he did it openly in the final month of the 2020 election. He was publicly pressuring Bill Barr to go after Joe Biden, and we called it corrupt at the time because it is. The president is not supposed to, and they shouldn't be allowed to use the DOJ to pressure some kind of political outcome. this is like a big disagreement that you and I have. I don't think that this is a reasonable proposition.
Well, let me ask you this.
I think he would have been impeached. I think Biden would have been impeached by his own party. He would have done something like that.
Apart from the strategy tied to Build Back Better, do you think Joe Manchin's daughter should be prosecuted anyway?
I'm not familiar with the case, but if she is like breaking the law or whatever, of course, I mean, I would support anybody who is doing any kind of like, what did you say she was involved with? Like it's some kind of pharma thing?
Involved with, she works for a pharmaceutical company, and she was involved in jacking the price of insulin. But even beyond that, if you take Kyrsten Sinema, for example, there were articles coming out about how she took, I forget the exact number, it was either $1 million or $2 million from pharma lobbyists. And at that exact time, she flipped her vote and was against lowering all the drug prices. They ended up getting a compromise where they ended up lowering, I believe it was 10 drug prices and then more over time.
Kyrsten Sinema really undercut that. But again, what would we even use against Kyrsten Sinema when we don't have the daughter? We don't have any criminal liability. We could just throw like Kyrsten Sinema or her family.
But so my point is,
we're gonna find like her daughter has like a lemonade stand that's not up to permit.
That's an example of like brazen corruption, but technically it's legal. So to have a president basically call that out and say, we're not going to stand for it, and we're going to use hard politics behind the scenes to try to get good things done for the American people, I don't view that as corrupt. I view that as a competent president fighting for the American people. And I think that's the core of our disagreement, because if you look at, say, like the filibuster, for example, I think the filibuster is kind of absurd. I'd be okay with going back to the original filibuster where you actually have to filibuster, like you have to talk. But now
where
they
the
just
burden
say,
is actually on the filibustering party and not something where they can just kick back.
Now they just say, I'm invoking the filibuster and you need 60 votes to get it through. So even with something, to your point about like, oh, you know, I don't think it's fecklessness, the parliamentarian thing. Well, then it's definitely fecklessness to not at least have more exceptions to the filibuster or go back to the original filibuster, because there's already 161 exceptions to the filibuster. Why not add more for specific policies? Like Kamala came out to her credit the other day and
she's going to say, yeah, she said there's going to be an exception for reintroduction of Roe versus Wade, which is how Colin Aldrin and a bunch of other people are now running on the policy. They wouldn't be able to otherwise. If Democrats don't control the Senate, we can't reinstitute Roe versus Wade as the law of the land. If Democrats control the House and the Senate and the presidency, then they can. And the only way they can is by making an exception for the filibuster. Joe Manchin will be gone. Kyrsten Sinema will be gone. So these people who were problems on this filibuster are going to be gone if we can get Colin Aldrin in Texas, if we lose Montana, or we keep Montana, or we're just able to, period, through a number of different seats that we're competing for right now, able to have 50 votes in the Senate. Taking them out of the House is much more likely. Taking the Senate, that is something that is going to be very hard for Democrats, and the odds are currently against them. We're the big underdogs there.
Said we'd get rid of the filibuster for Roe v. Wade. I don't know why you just stop there. You're arbitrarily handcuffing yourself. And if the argument is, well, down the road, Republicans will use 51 votes to get bad things, and it's like, okay, and then they'll lose the election and you get back in there and you do good things again. So I think the filibuster is undemocratic and we should nuke the filibuster. And so I don't view these things as like corrupt on behalf of Biden if he were to fight for these things. I view it as like, that's what I want from a president. FDR threatened to pack the Supreme Court. And just because of the threat, the Republicans backed down and voted to keep what was it?
But his own Congress said no. But going back to your point there, it's difficult for me to wrap my head around this idea that threatening to wield the...
Okay, let me throw this out there. Let's say Trump was president of the United States, and we found out that Donald Trump leveraged the possibility of going after Tim Walz's children or somebody else with criminal liability, whether it be for DUI charge, corruption charge, whatever, in order to get him to vote against environmental regulations. Like, there should be consistent standards. If the standards are not upheld consistently, and only one side is holding up the standard, then I understand, like, complaining, saying we should not do that, and one side, you know, we got to do what we got to do in order to keep some power balance, because if we just let them break all the rules and we follow them all, then we can get curb stomped. But what we're talking about right now is a breaking with precedent. What we're talking about right now is not upholding the standard. And I wanted some acknowledgement of at least a downside here, right? About how the corrosive effect this can have.
DOJ as your personal political tool, like you can't, it's difficult for me to understand. You can't see how that could backfire if all of a sudden this became the new norm, because there's no laws technically.
Well, you already said Republicans are already doing
determine
it.
whether or not yeah, but they get bad press for that. Like that, Donald Trump is the first one-term president since 1992. It was the most ineffective president in terms of legislation in modern history. He got the tax cuts done. That's the only thing he got done.
Yeah,
so this
but
idea
he
that
did a lot of
him
bad
being,
things.
But I guess the
he did
point
a lot
is
of bad things, but
things,
did,
yeah.
off of
did that corrupt pressure actually help him with his legislative agenda? I would
We're sort
say
of
I would argue the opposite.
we're sort of obsessing over this one example Kyle gave about the daughter. But I think the broader point is that there did not really seem to be any efforts to twist Joe Manchin's arm. Or to even offer like, hey, what do you want in West Virginia? Like, I'm not above that kind of like favor trading also.
That latter option, that was the one I suggested at the time. Favor trading for local infrastructure investment. And honestly, as somebody who has a lot of family in West Virginia, and I love West Virginia dearly, it's not like West Virginia couldn't use it.
Give him the equivalent of the Cornhusker kickback or whatever. It seemed like there was much more willingness to just accept a.
The reason we're talking about this specific one is it was one that was thrown around a lot at the time. And the reason this is being talked about is I would see certain complaints from alt media commentators, and I assume this is why Hutch and Pondering are interested in it. And the commentary had to be along the lines of, well, if the Democrats were just tougher. And every time I would hear that, or stronger, or, more resilient, or just they looked at the Republicans and they had some grit in their teeth, and they had that sparkle in their eyes showing that they weren't gonna give an inch, and that they were pure 110% ground American beef. They're just not gonna take whatever it is, right? Strength. And then you'd ask, okay, what does that mean in actuality, instead of just you want our politicians to be stronger? And then actual specifics there wasn't many options. Because it was, well, let's run a primary opponent against Joe Manchin. Okay, number one, who? Pramila Jayapal? No. And if we do, what's the odds that they're just going to lose? Because Joe Manchin, being a Democrat senator from West Virginia, already was a bloody miracle, okay? That's the first thing. Second thing, this daughter option, again, was about the weaponization of the Justice Department in order to get this legislation passed. And it would be the selective exclusion of our politically reached children from criminal liability, which I don't think is good. Now, if it was if you could justify it in the long run as to say, like, well, then we would get this one piece of legislation passed, and in the long run, like, institutionally, we deal with this problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't even hear, like, any objection to the fact that this would even have to be the rules of the road. I understand if you're in a brutal situation and the rules are gone, you do what's necessary, and it might be unscrupulous, it might be distasteful, but there doesn't even seem to be like a tiny bit of distaste.
Feet.
Well, they're against it. Okay.
Then he's against it. The parliamentarians against it. I guess we just can't do these things. And it speaks to the broader, I think, kind of philosophical or tactical disagreements that that we may have with you both, which is like, it seems like whenever it comes to that economically beneficial, progressive, or as I said before, it's really a centrist agenda, it seems like there's a lot more quit on that side of the ledger versus the embracing of a Dick Cheney or a Liz Cheney. And, to get back to that debate, one thing I wanted to ask about on the tactical soundness is, obviously Michigan is one of the most key states in terms of Kamala's likely political, path to 270. It probably runs through Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And there is a significant Arab American voting bloc in Michigan, and there's polling that suggests that a majority of them are actually going to vote for Jill Stein. You can tell Democrats are concerned about this because they're running now anti-Jill Stein ads. I cannot think that it helps their case when these voters are looking at the fact that you didn't have room for even a pro-Kamala Palestinian American speaker on the DNC stage, but somehow you have room for Dick Cheney in your party.
So again, I just want to say, as somebody who brought that up at the beginning, I totally believe, it's easy for me to armchair quarterback.
I really don't see why they didn't have just some speaker at the DNC. I'm sure that some of the people that were demanding that would never have been satisfied no matter however it was, but you do need to send signals to these communities, that you're willing to listen to them, that you're willing to consider their, you know, their pain, and you're willing to represent them if you want to make any desirable or at least half-hearted pitch to them.
But looking back on, I do think that that was a colossal mistake by Vice President Harris, given the inclusivity of the DNC. And I was there. I mean, you had, it was a totally wide range to not have, and I'm blanking on her name, but she was a state representative, I think from Georgia.
Yeah.
Yes, who was going to endorse the vice president and pro-Palestinian. I think that was a colossal error, 100%. And it almost undermined the inclusivity argument. But going back to the Cheney thing versus Michigan, I want to be very clear, and I don't want to speak for Hutch, but knowing him as I do, I'm confident he would agree with this. If you were able to produce polling which said, listen, yeah, Harris's approval rating or support among Republicans has gone from 5 to, I think, 9, according to the last New York Times Siena poll, but she's lost 15%, like in the same time, or like she's lost an equal or comparable or greater amount from liberals and otherwise people who are inclined to vote for her as a consequence of that, then I think we'd all agree, well, then screw the Cheneys, jettison. We should always, if given a binary choice, I think we should just lean left more towards trying to appeal to the right. But I think Hutch's position, and this is where I feel, unless I can get evidence to the contrary, that accepting the endorsement of Liz Cheney, I just don't think, or have not seen data, that that's going to cost votes from the left flank. I can't imagine somebody's gonna be like, hell yeah, I'm gonna vote for Kamala Harris. She's accepted Tim Walz, but you know what? She said something nice about Liz Cheney, so I'm gonna vote third party. I've just not seen any evidence.
Yeah, it's not the specific, you're right. It's not that specific thing. It's evidence of a potential broader trend which could be damaging.
Well, but I actually think there is evidence of this specific thing, which, you know, obviously.
That she dropped 2 points right when she did it?
Yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint, but she was doing better in the polls before.
Come on. There's a million, like the theory of a honeymoon period, that you just got this new candidate. Most Americans wanted a new candidate besides the two. Now you have one, you know. She's throwing out some beautiful language out there. You're projecting your ideas as to what she believes and what she could represent onto the candidate. She then has to clarify who she is. And, you know, people, you know, it could be a million different things. Then Liz Cheney, 2% drop, even the 0.5% drop. I don't know. That's a stretch. You want to see those tea leaves look like that. So that cloud looks like a trombone. No, it doesn't. You just want it to look like a trombone. You're a music student.
Leaned hard into the Cheney world, both Liz and Dick. You know, when she was bringing Tim Walz on board, when she was announcing her price gouging proposal, when she was getting attacked as a communist for daring to stand up to companies that are, you know, ripping off American consumers, that's when she was doing her best. And so the slippage hasn't been massive, but given that it's a very closely divided country, it is significant and something we shouldn't ignore. And so now you're much more at like a 50-50 likelihood of success post Cheney world, you know, embrace, versus previously it was more like a 60-40. And again,
come on, really? What, it was like a 10% drop in likelihood because she accepted Liz Cheney's endorsement? Nah, come on.
And those things are significant. I'm not saying it's 100% determinative, but you do have to look at what she was doing in the campaign when it was succeeding at its highest levels versus how they're doing at this point.
So
yeah, but then the problem wouldn't be Liz Cheney's endorsement. The problem would be the focus of the campaign. That, like, hey, a few campaign stops here in Republican neighborhoods with Republican leaders to try to win over a bipartisan vote, versus like I don't know, like a Liz Cheney tour with like full, like she's like up there playing the kazoo. It's like a full like Liz Cheney TED Talk.
Agree with you, but I also think she has, since then, she's also saved it a little bit more. Like they've gotten better within the past few days because they're calling him a fascist and because she did the Fox News interview. But I agree with you that initially when it looked like that was going to be the trajectory, which is a very Hillary 2016 type trajectory, I was like, oh no, they're going to do it again. But let me ask you guys, because this is my grand theory, and I call this the Goldilocks zone for campaigning. I'm curious what both of you think of it. So to me, I actually like the idea of Kamala self-branding. I'm a centrist. I'm a moderate. Say those words and say it in every single interview. I actually love that. But I want her to pair it with saying, I'm a centrist. That's why I want to do free school breakfast and lunch for kids like Tim Walz did in Minnesota. I'm a centrist. I want 12 weeks paid family leave and 12 weeks paid sick leave. So make that the centrist position and then run with it. And then it becomes like, you know, it's a branding thing. People be like, oh, Kamala, yeah, she's a centrist, right? But they associate that with good. Exactly. So what do you guys think of that?
I mean, I take your point. I mean, I feel like paid family leave has what, like 80% approval with the public?
It's about that, yeah.
Yeah, child tax credit, 70%, all those things are very popular.
Right.
Crazy thing is, though, if it's popular and she says it, Trump might just say it and just not mean it. And what I mean by that is Hillary endorsed paid family leave back in 2016, a week after Trump did, just with like 2 weeks difference in how much it should be. He then won, and then he never moved on it.
The difficult thing with public opinion polls,
I could imagine him doing the same thing again
for specific policies, is that it doesn't necessarily indicate like, okay, it's going to be like 80% easy to get it done, because we all know that
obviously,
in the Congress, with the way that everything's set up, the Republicans have these institutional advantages, and it's just really hard to get popular policy over the finish line. I lost my train of thought there. Josiah, you want to jump in there?
Well, no, I was going to say, so it's funny. I'm reminded of what Governor Walz said recently. It was like, you know, one man's socialism is another man's neighborliness. And he got grilled on this, or at least she attempted to do so, Shannon Bream on Fox News. So she's like, so, you know, this is the dictionary definition of socialist. So is this what you're getting at? And he's like, no, it's just that Donald Trump refers to anything Democrats ever tried to do ever as socialism.
Yeah,
and
he
I'm
handled
saying
that really well.
Right, exactly. I'm saying that lazy, lax definition just refers to basic common sense things.
Let me.
Sorry, I
was just gonna say real quick,
Okay,
as far as like the moderate thing, I'm not the person to ask on this, Kyle, because when I hear the word centrist, I get triggered immensely because I have enormous contempt for it. But you're right. I mean, there is obviously an appeal to that, and maybe, you know, a branding campaign, just like she's trying to do with patriotism. This idea that patriotism.
Yeah. Some people hear centrist and they just equal that to reasonable. Some people hear centrist and they equal that to, oh, I'm kind of almost like a you know, I'm above the partisan divide. I will take a good policy from here and a good policy from there, you know.
Is actually
you float above the rest of us.
Liberal or progressive value, because we love our country enough to recognize that it has issues that we need to fix, whereas Republicans and this cult of personality, they don't love America. They love Donald Trump and would gleefully sell this country and all of its constituents down the river. So there may be some utility in what you're talking about.
Go ahead, Josiah.
I also want to say that there's a little bit of it's a tricky situation with politics right now, and in terms of like what you run on for your legislative agenda, because I feel like you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Like typically in this country, politicians will run on their agenda, and oftentimes it'll be a very ambitious agenda that maybe they even know they're likely not going to be able to get from the Congress that's elected that next session. So we heard, I mean, I feel like Joe Biden has got a lot of criticism for promising a $15 an hour minimum wage, and that didn't happen. Promising like more student loan debt, that didn't happen because of the Supreme Court and other factors. And so, you know, if you run on I feel like if she gets a 50-50 Senate, which it looks like that's probably the best that we can get, and that even that's kind of a long shot right now. The Senate's not looking great. I feel like she's taking a different approach of actually trying to promise policies that seem realistic in their ability to get done. Like if she was running on Medicare for all right now, it might get a lot of like young progressives excited, but there would be no way for I think all of us would probably agree, there would be no way that would pass in the next Congress. And so it seems to be a different strategy that like Biden took with over promising. She seems to be going a more realistic.
He was talking about a public option, man, which I was like, hey, that's a step forward, but we got like no movement, zero.
Route. I personally kind of appreciate that honesty, and I'm curious what you guys have to say about that.
She is running on getting rid of medical debt. That was one of the original things that she proposed in that first list that she put out. And there are Democratic governors across the country who are buying up medical debt for everybody in their state for pennies on the dollar, and then they're wiping it out. And like that's the kind of stuff
and it's very popular.
Love to see, and that's something that.
And when you poll people, like, do you want your tax dollars paying to get rid of like elderly people's medical debt? It polls well, man.
And then they're wiping it out. And like that's the kind of stuff I love to see, and that's something that she rolled out. Now, I would like to see her talk about that more, but to me, I almost have a slight disagreement in the sense that I think she's being a little more ambitious than you're giving her credit for. I think the $6,000 child tax credit is super ambitious, and I love that she's running on that.
Yeah. I guess here's what I would say is, again, there's a question of tactics and substance. So the student loan debt example is a really important one because this was not a policy that Joe Biden would have, I think, I hope we all agree, probably would not have pursued if he wasn't under pressure in a Democratic primary situation. But he was under pressure, and so he promised a certain policy. Now, that policy, for a variety of reasons, was not able to come into fruition.
Some of it was.
But if he hadn't been forced on the campaign trail to take that position, then I don't think he would have done any of it, because it wasn't so, like, he dragged his feet about it. He wasn't in love with it, but because he had said this, he was under a lot of pressure by activists to get something done during his administration. And they actually have done a significant amount in terms of student loan debt relief.
Yes.
So on the substance, I think it actually is important that we get politicians on the record about promises they're making to the electorate.
Hey guys, this is just a small piece.
And that's
of
that.
the
Man, they didn't convince me about, the politicization of, weaponization of the criminal justice system to get votes passed. They certainly didn't convince me about the primary stuff. I think that's a terrible idea. I will say, the one thing we did find agreement is the carrot approach, the offering of local infrastructure projects. And in West Virginia, I think they certainly need it. We are here and we are debatably queer. Debatably in House O. Who's debating it? Who's having this debate? Why debatably?